Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are thrilled to be joined by our guest, Professor Ian Boardley. Listeners, Ian is Head of Impact and Engagement, Professor in Sport and Exercise Psychology, and Chair of the Health and Safety Committee for the College of Life and Environmental Sciences in the School of Sport, Exercise, and Rehabilitation Sciences at the University of Birmingham in the UK. And today we are looking forward to discussing his research on the psychosocial processes governing moral behavior in sport and physical activity. So, Ian, welcome to the show today. How are you?
I'm good, thanks, Maria. Thank you for the invitation to come on the podcast. I've listened to many episodes and enjoyed it, so I was delighted to get the invitation. Thank you.
Well, we are so excited to hear that you've been listening to the show, and we're delighted to have you with us today. And I'm excited to learn more about you and the amazing research that you've been doing. But perhaps to give our listeners a little bit of background here, can you share, Ian, how you originally got interested in science and perhaps how you found your way to your current positions there at the University of Birmingham?
Yeah, I think I even go back as far as when I was at school. I was always interested in the sciences, across all the sciences, really. And from there, I actually went straight from school and worked in the food industry and worked in a laboratory for a number of years and studied chemistry at the same time while I was working in the food industry. But I'd always been really interested in sport as well and decided sort of in my 20s that I wanted to have a career in sport. So I thought, well, the best thing to do would be to leave my current job, go back to university and study sports science. And while I was there, decide which part of sport I wanted to work in and which direction to take. So I went back to University of Leeds, did a bachelor's degree in sports science and took a real interest in psychology. So following my bachelor's degree, I completed a PhD in sports psychology at the University of Birmingham. That was from 2005 to 2008. And I was very lucky, an academic position came up here at Birmingham just as I was finishing my PhD, and I was lucky enough to secure that. And then I've been here ever since. So it's really a combination of sort of my lifelong interest in the sciences, but also heavy involvement in sport, both in my personal life, but wanting to pursue a career in sport. That sort of led me to bring the two together and find myself here at Birmingham. And since then, I've been lucky enough to continue to sort of pursue my interests in psychology, looking particularly at how people justify and rationalize doing things that on some level, you probably realize that they shouldn't do. So some of those psychological mechanisms that you mentioned in the introduction, and that was my doctoral research, and a lot of my research since then has pursued those mechanisms as well. So yeah, I've been very lucky to be able to do that, sort of bring up many aspects of my life together, I think.
I love that. And you mentioned this position that you have right now brings together your passion for sport and your passion for science. We heard a little bit about your scientific background, but were you an athlete as well?
Well, it depends how you define athlete, I guess. Mm-hmm. So I played a lot of sport and I still am very active now. So yeah, I was a field hockey player. I'll make the distinction with a North American audience. If I just say hockey, it might be misunderstood, but I'm not particularly good on the ice.
Sure.
But yeah, I was a goalkeeper in field hockey and played to sort of a national standard in hockey for over 20 years. But towards the end of my playing years of hockey, I started running. So a very good friend of mine was an elite runner. So it got me into running and started running marathons. And now I run marathons and longer than marathons. So I've run over 100 miles 13 times now, I think. And I've lost count of marathons, but they're definitely well over 50. So yeah, I'm still training and active. So I probably don't run at the same level that I played hockey, but a reasonable club standard, I think. And if I keep getting older and don't get slower, I think then my relative performance gets better. That's the way I like to look at it anyway.
I like that perspective. Well, it's great to hear more about your sport and athletic side. And let's talk a little bit more about this position there at the University of Birmingham. Can you share what your roles are? We mentioned just those different titles that you have and just the broad scope of the research that you do in your lab there.
I'm quite lucky again, I guess. So as an academic, as many academics, I have sort of responsibilities that are around research, teaching and administration. But I'm quite lucky in that there's sort of overlap between each of those areas. So as I'm sure we'll go on to discuss in a bit more detail later, my research, and you've mentioned in the introduction as well, a lot of it's focused on, in part, sort of moral behavior, or certainly historically, but now more and more focused on doping in sport and enhancement drug use in exercise populations. So that's a lot of my research focus, but I also teach on a module that is very much focused on doping and enhancement substance use. So in that way, I'm able to deliver teaching that is very much research informed and research based. And that's quite nice that you've got that overlap and that you've been able to utilize your research in your teaching as well. But another module that I lead is focused on, to a large degree, something that we refer to as research impact. And that's not the impact in academia, but the impact of research outside academia. So what we'd refer to as non-academic impact. So how our research might inform policies, decisions, practice in society. So I deliver a module on that, but I'm also, as you mentioned in the introduction, head of impact and engagement within the school here. And the responsibilities there are very much around trying to maximize the amount of impact that the research that's being conducted in the school can have externally. So it's about ensuring people are making those connections externally with the right people, making sure that they're engaging with stakeholders throughout the research process to ensure that as much as is possible, depending on the research area, people are conducting research that is of use and is of the type of research that the beneficiaries, the end users of research would like to see done. And that brings us back to my own research as well, which I'm very motivated by conducting research that is useful externally as well. So quite often I'm collaborating and working very closely with key stakeholders from the time that I'm designing my research. And then I feel through that you can deliver research that is much more meaningful and useful. So, for example, I've got a project running at the moment that's in collaboration with UK Anti-Doping. And then I've got another research project that we're just completing that's funded by the World Anti-Doping Agency. And throughout the research process, we're engaging with those key stakeholders and beneficiaries to make sure the research that we're doing is of relevance to their work and as much use as possible. So hopefully through that, I've been able to describe how, although there are three distinct areas of my responsibilities in my role here, there's also quite a lot of convergence and overlap between them, which is very nice for me because it means that a lot of the work that I'm doing feels relevant regardless of which of those primary responsibilities I'm working on.
Certainly. And I agree with you, Ian, that it's just so important to be getting these research findings out in the world to help inform decision making and to continue improving the world and continue improving sport as well, particularly for your research. So let's dig into some of the research topics that you've been involved in. I know you're particularly well known for your work on this idea of moral disengagement and bringing this concept to the field of sport and exercise psychology. So Ian, can you explain a little bit for listeners out there who might not be familiar with it, what moral disengagement is and maybe how it's linked to performance enhancing drug use or other antisocial behaviors you may see in sport?
It's quite interesting. I always found moral disengagement quite interesting because the first time you refer to the term moral disengagement, people don't always necessarily know what you're talking about quite naturally and they don't recognize it. But as soon as you start to give some examples, people start to recognize it. And I always, when I'm speaking with doctoral students who are working on moral disengagement, what they'll often say to me, and a sort of thought process that I've had is that once you know what moral disengagement is, you see it everywhere. So you see it across all different domains of life. So it's basically, to define it, is a series of 8 psychosocial mechanisms. So psychosocial in that each of them involves certain thought processes, but they're all socially situated. So it's what's happening around us. So psychologically, we're using things around us to justify and rationalize engaging in harmful or rule-breaking behaviors. So societally, you might think about people who are maybe avoiding tax, coming up with rationalizations and justifications that might suggest that it's the fault of the tax service because they charge too much. So that would be an example of what we would call displacement of responsibility, where we're placing the responsibility on someone else for our actions. Within sport, a good example of one I often use is for a mechanism known as moral justification. And that's where you're able to convince yourself that your harmful behavior is justified because there's a perceived social benefit. So for doping in sport, if you've got a professional athlete, and this is an example that we've taken from our own research when we've interviewed people who have admitted to doping in the past, they say that because of the increased money that they can make, they can supply for their family much better. So it becomes part of the rationalization for engaging in the behavior. They're just 2 examples of the mechanisms, but there are 8 mechanisms, each of which, if you engage in one of them, you're more likely to engage in the other ones as well. These mechanisms come from a theory that was originally created by Albert Bandura, who some of the audience might recognize as one of the foremost social psychologists in history. And Bandura's original work was in society and looking at antisocial behavior in society. But it was within my doctoral research that I started to read some of Bandura's work and I was recognizing these mechanisms and thinking, actually, I've seen this all the time. I mentioned earlier about playing hockey, and you think about people who break the rules, and then you obviously listen to them explaining why they did, and you recognize the mechanisms. And that was what originally got my interest in it, and thought this is relevant in sport as well. And that's what I was able to show through my doctoral research, was that when we see high levels of moral disengagement, we also see people who engage much more in antisocial behavior on the sports field. And then following my doctoral studies, I conducted an initial study looking at whether we saw examples of moral disengagement with people who used enhancement substances in exercise populations. So people using anabolic steroids in gyms. And again, we saw evidence of 6 of the 8 mechanisms. And I then applied for funding from the World Anti-Doping Agency to fund a national study. We conducted interviews with almost 70 people who had used anabolic steroids and associated substances, corroborated what was seen in the initial smaller study, that we see good evidence of when you ask people to explain their use, it's these 6 mechanisms that you're seeing coming up time and time again. And then subsequently to that, in quantitative research, well, we've developed measures to measure moral disengagement in doping. And we've shown with those measures that when we see people morally disengaged, we see greater risk, or actually greater reported use of doping in sport and enhancement drug use in exercise populations. So those same associations that we saw in the sports field, we're also seeing off the pitch as well with the doping enhancement substance use.
Very interesting. And I think, Ian, reflecting on some of the examples that you just shared, this moral disengagement can be insidious, and it's obviously dangerous for fair sport. So can you talk about what are some of the approaches that the clean sport movement could potentially use to combat some of this moral disengagement in athletes, or even athlete support personnel or others?
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that in terms of being insidious. And one of the key things that Bandura said in the original theory, and what's been shown in research since, is that moral disengagement is very much socially communicated and socially situated. So it can be quite pervasive in that when you get a small number, say, of people in a certain population who are morally disengaging for a certain behavior, other people will hear that, see that, and if it's not challenged, potentially feel that therefore it is okay to act in that way in that circumstance, because they're rationalizing it in that way. The coach isn't challenging it. Other players aren't challenging it. Therefore, maybe I'm okay to do that in that circumstance. So an example often from doping is when someone's coming back from injury. It's known as a risk period for doping. And again, some of our own research with people who have doped have identified that when they first started doping, it was when they were coming back from injury. The coach had suggested it and said, actually, all you're doing is taking yourself back to a similar level of performance, but you just need to get there quicker. And because of the time period that you've got available. So saying that in those circumstances, it's okay to dope. So one of the best ways I think we can try to combat the use of moral disengagement is to increase awareness of the mechanisms and the dangers of not challenging people rationalizing and justifying whether it's doping or whether it's other forms of transgressive behavior in sport that we see on the pitch. Because what we also see is evidence of transfer of use of the mechanisms from one context to the next. And especially when everything's embodied within one context, such as sport, it's possible that when people are learning to morally disengage in one element of sport, that might transfer to other areas of sports. And I don't think it's even necessary to understand the specifics of the 8 mechanisms. It's almost like when you hear people starting to rationalize and justify engaging in behaviors that we know are harmful or against the rules, then it's important to challenge that, because not challenging it can be perceived as supporting it. So I think without going into the specifics of all of the different mechanisms and challenging particular mechanisms, I think that's one of the main things we can do is recognize when people are rationalizing and justifying doing something that's wrong. We need to challenge that.
Definitely. I think this awareness is important, and having people be on alert and sort of monitoring it, not only in themselves, but in teammates and their coaches, whoever the athlete support personnel may be in that case.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just the athletes, it's the full team around the athletes, isn't it? And just being alert to that, I think it would be a great first step.
Certainly. And I think the work that you've done has been tremendously helpful for advancing the field. And as research fields advance, scientists have to develop new tools and measures in order to continue answering novel questions. And Ian, I know that you and your team recently published a paper describing the development and validation of 2 new measures that are relevant for anti-doping. And these 2 are anabolic-androgenic steroid dependence and also craving. So Ian, can you talk about why it was critical to create these particular new measures?
I should probably give credit here to a colleague of mine who was a PhD student, but has now completed his PhD, Barnaby Zub-Carter. This was part of his doctoral research. But one of the things that was of interest to Barney was, in particular, anabolic steroid dependence. So there's quite a lot of evidence that when people use anabolic steroids, there's quite a significant risk of developing dependence. And athletes and people in gyms are not always aware of this, but some evidence with the existing measures suggests that at least 30% of people who use anabolic steroids are experiencing dependence. And there's a number of reasons for that, but the existing measures are more diagnostic. So trying to diagnose whether someone is dependent or is not. And what we wanted to do was to develop something that it wouldn't be diagnostic, but it's looking at what levels of dependence we're seeing. And also to understand some of the sub-dimensions, some of the different aspects of dependence, because in the past, it's really been more about diagnosing whether someone is dependent or not. So what we found when we developed the measure of dependence, and this was informed by some of the existing theories around dependence, was evidence for 5 different dimensions of dependence. So one of those is about effectiveness. So often within people who use anabolic steroids, there'll be a point where people feel as though they've got to a plateau and they weren't improving anymore. So the effectiveness dimension is more about people increasing their use and feeling the need to either go on a longer cycle of anabolic steroids or use greater doses to try and increase their improvements or the gains that they're getting from use. Another one I think is very important to understand is around withdrawal. So what we saw was that quite often people are using anabolic steroids to avoid some of the withdrawal effects. So they're feeling particularly bad because of the physiological effects. So one of the main effects of anabolic steroids is because people often use them at such superphysiological doses, the feedback mechanisms in the body mean that we no longer produce testosterone ourselves. Problem is, once you stop taking that exogenous anabolic steroid, then you can get a crash in very low levels in the body, which can lead to low mood. And so even if people want to stop, they try to stop or they go onto an off cycle and then they experience these withdrawal effects. And then that becomes a reason to start using again. And what we're starting to see anecdotally, I think, is more people going on to consistent use, so never really coming off cycle. And I think it's partly these withdrawal effects that are leading to that, because people are telling us how they feel when they're not on cycle. They have a shorter and shorter off cycle until they get to a point where they maybe permanently stay on cycle, and all they're doing is just changing the amount that they're taking, or something that's referred to as a blast and cruise cycle, where they'll go to high doses and lower doses, but never actually come off, which potentially is even more harmful than the types of use that we saw historically. So because within our measure, we can capture these different elements of dependence, hopefully it'll be able to, over time, give us greater insight of which of these elements and aspects of dependence that are most predictive of harmful use and increased use. But also, I think this comes back to awareness as well, because I think a lot of the people, when they're making the decisions to start using anabolic steroids, are not aware that it can lead to a dependence. I think people think that they might only use 1 or 2 cycles of anabolic steroids and then stop. I think if people are more aware of the mechanisms that can actually lead them to be dependent and for long-term use, then it might change people's decision-making in the first part. The other measure that we developed was around craving, and anecdotally again, and in some interviews that were conducted with people who use anabolic steroids, we could see evidence of craving. And obviously craving's been looked at with other forms of drug use, but had never been looked at with anabolic steroids before. So in other areas of substance use, quite often we'll see craving looked at alongside dependence. So we wanted to develop a measure of craving as well. And interestingly, what we saw was that for the different facets of craving was that some of those different facets are quite similar to what we see in craving for other types of drug use. So some of those are very much sort of environmentally based. So people will experience craving more when they're in certain environments. So if they're around people that they know use steroids, then they will start to crave use themselves when they place themselves in that environment. So if they're in the gym, for example, they're more likely to crave the use of anabolic steroids than in a non-gym or non-sporting environment. Other elements are around expectation, because although anabolic steroids are not a psychoactive drug, they still are often associated with positive feelings of well-being. So some of those feelings and how people anticipate feeling when they're using anabolic steroids become part of the driver for the behavior as well. Interestingly, again, for craving, we saw another subdimension that looked at trying to avoid or craving it when they're in a negative mood. So that withdrawal period that I talked about, quite often people will feel down in that period or might feel increased anxiety or tension. And that becomes a period where we see increases in craving as well, because use of anabolic steroids is seen as a way of stopping those feelings.
That makes sense. And I think creating these new measures takes quite a bit of work. So can you walk us through how they were developed and what were some of the results of your assessments then once you did develop them surrounding the validity of these measurements?
Over the years, I've developed quite a few psychometric measures. So the process is quite similar across each of those. So the first thing you have to do is develop some items that make sense to the people who are going to be completing them. So you need to make sure that although you might have a defined theory that you want to capture things on, you have to make sure that they also have face validity for the people that are completing them. Quite often what we'll look at is any qualitative research. We'll look at interviews with people who have experienced craving. So in this case, craving or dependence, and look at the type of language they'll use and also the broader literature around anabolic steroid use. And you look at that alongside the theory, so existing theory around craving, existing theory around dependence, and develop items that fit with what we see in other domains for craving and dependence. So making sure the items fit within sort of the theory that you're interested in, but also making sure that they have face validity to the people who will complete them. And then have to go out and collect data, overdevelop the items. You develop more items than you expect to need, and then you can choose which are the best items amongst them. You also make sure that you've captured all the different aspects of the psychological construct as well. So obviously it's quite challenging when you're developing a measure that's specific to people who use anabolic steroids, because if you're developing a measure just with a sporting population, you've got many more people to access, and also it's not a hard to reach population. So Barney did great work and collected data from a few hundred anabolic steroid users, which is not easy to do. And we asked them to complete the measures with all the item sets in there. Once we've done that, we'll use something called factor analysis. So I talked about those different aspects, different dimensions within a measure there, or what you would refer to as different subscales. Factor analysis basically is looking at which items are correlated with one another. So if you administer a measure with 30 items, which are the ones that are grouping together that if someone scores high on that, they score high on another item as well. So the factor analysis allows us to look and identify what those different subdimensions might be. And then depending on how strong those associations are, we can then identify which are the best items to capture each of the dimensions. So what you will normally do is collect data with one sample. You'll identify what you think is the sort of dimensional structure using factor analysis. You'll also, from that, select what you think are the best items to capture each of the subdimensions. And then you'll go to a second sample. And this is a really important step because you don't want to develop a measure that only works with that individual sample. And then with the second sample, you then ensure that you get the same results, that the same items are still very good indicators of it. You see in the same dimensional structure, and the same items are good indicators of each of those subdimensions as well. And that's basically the process in a nutshell that we went through with these two measures. So it was the same samples that were completing the measures of dependence and craving separately. And through that process, we were able to identify what the different dimensions of each of them were, and also which were the best items to use to capture them. And then the final step is that you also administer other measures alongside that you, based on theory, like an existing measure of dependence. I mentioned the one that's used as a diagnostic tool. We administered that as well. And then we're looking to see, does our measure correlate strongly with the existing measures? We also administered our measure that we'd previously developed for moral disengagement, so doping moral disengagement, because you would anticipate that people who have high levels of dependence, probably using higher doses, been using anabolic steroids for longer, you'd expect them to have high levels of doping moral disengagement as well. You're looking at existing measures of the same construct, but you're also looking at other theoretically associated constructs to see that this pattern of relationships you see amongst these different variables as you would anticipate them to be. So supporting the validity of the measure. Because the thing with psychological measures is you're always building evidence for how valid the measure is. The more times it's used, the more other variables it's measured alongside, the better evidence you've got that you're actually capturing what you're planning to capture. So that what we were doing was presenting initial evidence for that this correlates with existing measures of dependence, correlates with measures of moral disengagement and other associated constructs. And also it doesn't correlate with things that it shouldn't correlate with. And with that, you can at least start to establish the evidence base that you've got a good measure.
Definitely. And I think this final step of checking the validity, the pressure is on at that point. So Ian, what were you finding? Were these measures valid?
So we saw strong positive relationship between each of the subdimensions of dependence and craving with moral disengagement. We also saw negative relationships with something called doping self-regulatory efficacy. So that's a measure of how confident someone is in their ability to resist doping or use of enhancement substance. So we wouldn't expect to see a positive correlation with self-regulatory efficacy, and we didn't see that. What we also looked at was the relationships between each of those subdimensions as well. If these are all measuring aspects of dependence for the dependence measure, then they should be at least moderately correlated with one another. We saw that as well. So that was good to see and provided further evidence. So you don't want those relationships to be too strong, because otherwise, what's the point in having the different subdimensions? And what we were seeing was moderate to strong relationships amongst them, which shows evidence that they're measuring a similar higher order construct, but they are separate from one another as well. And that's what we saw with the craving measure as well, in that they weren't too strongly correlated, the individual subdimensions, but they were strongly correlated enough to show they were all measuring something that was similar. And again, with the craving, we saw the positive relationships with moral disengagement and negative with self-regulatory efficacy, which is as we anticipated. And then you also see the positive relationship with the DSM-5 criteria, which was the existing way in which dependence was measured.
Going forward, do you have ideas of how these measures might be used and what are some of the potential impacts that they could have on the field?
Yeah, I think one of the main things is it's going to give us a greater understanding in terms of the craving. We'll be able to measure something that is perceived to fluctuate much more regularly. So dependence is seen as something that's quite stable over time. And that's why you would have a diagnostic measure that someone's seen as either dependent or they're not. Whereas with craving, as we see with other forms of drug use, this fluctuates much more on a daily basis. So craving would allow us to sort of conduct the type of research where we're maybe looking at when are the risk periods or the risk environments or what are the risk times within an athlete or an exerciser's life that they might be at greatest risk of using anabolic steroids. Similarly, with the dependence measure, because we've got the different subcomponents, we can start to look at which of those subdimensions might be related most with, say, points at which people will start to increase the doses. For example, with the effectiveness dimension, you would hypothesize that might be the one that if people are perceiving periods of plateau in performance, in strength or appearance, depending on what the motivator is, that's the point at which they might start to look at more continuous use of anabolic steroids, or it might be points at which that they'll increase the dose when they are on cycle. But you might hypothesize that, but historically we haven't been able to test that. Other elements of dependence relate to some of the physical and psychological and social harms of use. So if people are interested in some of those harms and those being associated with dependence, then we can now look at these individual dimensions and thought processes and identify which ones might be indicative of when people are at greatest risk.
Very interesting. And Ian, I think this is an exciting research area, but I know you've been working on several really exciting projects. So let's talk about this project. Last year, you wrapped up a research study funded by UK Anti-Doping that was conducted in collaboration with your colleague, Dr. Martin Chandler, as a co-investigator. And I know this project focused on developing a survey that could be incorporated into anti-doping education platforms to examine attitudes towards doping. So can you touch on this project a little bit?
Yeah, so as with many anti-doping organizations, some of the education that UK Anti-Doping deliver is through online learning. So what UK Anti-Doping wanted to do was to develop a tool that could capture or show the effectiveness of the education that was being conducted. So what we did in this project that Martin was working on, and this was in collaboration with a number of other colleagues, Andrea Petrozzi and Sue Backhouse at Kingston University and Leeds Beckett University. But what we looked to do is to develop a measure that was based around WADA's international standard for education. So in 2021, WADA brought in the first international standard for education that gave greater structure and informed educators around the type of education that should be delivered and how it should be monitored and evaluated. So I think that was part of the driver for this project funded by UK Anti-Doping. But what we wanted to do is to develop it. So within that international standard, there are 4 elements of education. So awareness raising, information provision, anti-doping education, and values-based education. that what the international standard says is that you should deliver education that's relevant to each of those 4 areas. So what we looked at existing measures that were available and validated, and then we selected what we thought were the best indicators of successful education for each of those 4 areas. And then we brought them together into sort of a tool that could be then used online in a sort of pre-post type design where people would complete the measures before engaging in the education and then complete them afterwards. Some elements of that will measure it. So moral disengagement would be in there, attitudes would be in there. So they're capturing more of the sort of values-based education would be in there, certainly in terms of moral disengagement. But then there's also more information. Also, it's important that athletes understand what the rights and responsibilities around testing are, what the testing process looks like. Because if you're in a testing pool and you're going to go through that, you need to understand what your rights and responsibilities are, whereabouts, those types of things. So we needed measures in there that would capture that as well. So we had a knowledge questionnaire in there that would relate to some of that information around anti-doping education specific to those types of issues. So it was quite a broad measure, but what we're looking for is that when athletes have conducted the education, that we should see improvements in each of these areas. And because we've got these different indicators, so legitimacy would be another example whereby, and there's evidence to show this, if education is effective, then we'll see increases in how legitimate athletes see the anti-doping system as a whole, but also the anti-doping organisation involved as well, how legitimate they are. And that is very important in terms of being a protective factor against people considering doping, because if we feel as though we've got an effective system, then we feel protected, then we're less likely to consider doing it ourselves. So because we've got these different components represented in the measure that we developed for UK anti-doping, it meant that they would be able to see which element of the international standard for education had been promoted by a particular type of education. And therefore, you can then use that information to develop and improve programs further as well. If you're seeing that, well, we're seeing improvements in knowledge, but we're not seeing improvements around sort of values-based education indicators, then we can change the way we deliver that or increase the amount of education we offer in certain areas. That was the aim of that. I know UK Anti-Doping are using that tool that we developed now in informing their monitoring and evaluation of their education programs. Again, it's a good example of what we were talking about earlier in terms of the impact that research can have and working directly with a stakeholder. So UK Anti-Doping were involved in that project throughout midterm reports and getting updates throughout the project, and we were reporting on which measures were included and so on as we went along.
Oh, very interesting. And you mentioned that you expected to see improvements in each of the areas that you mentioned. Is this what you actually saw when you looked at the data? And then also, if you could just comment on what you see as the potential impacts downstream. You mentioned that UCAD has been involved in this project and they're already starting to implement it. What sort of impacts do you expect to see in the anti-doping community?
In the initial validations, are again similar in some ways to what we were talking about earlier with the dependence and craving measure. We did include other measures that we didn't include in the final measure. So, for example, doping attitudes, we included different attitude measures, and then we selected the ones that were showing the strongest evidence that they were effective measures with the elite samples. So we collected data from 2 samples. The first one was competitive amateur athletes, but we also collected then data from elite athletes as well. And for the measures that ended up in the final measure, we were seeing evidence that supported the efficacy of what went into the final measure. In terms of impacts coming out, I know UCAD are only recently started using this in their education, but potential impacts, I think, relate to how anti-doping education will develop. So I mentioned the international standard for education. A key element of that is around evaluation. So what it says in this standard is that you should evaluate the education that you deliver, and then based on the findings of that evaluation, that should then inform future education delivery. So with the use of a tool like this, you can evaluate each of those 4 components of the education being delivered and see which ones are leading to the changes that you want to see in the athletes. And then you can potentially trial different types of delivery. So it might be in person versus online. It might be that you're bringing in athletes to use as sort of case examples you can vary the education delivery and then evaluate how effective that delivery is and what those changes bring about in terms of some of the outcomes with the measure. So at the moment, UK Anti-Doping are using it mainly for their online education delivery. So I think it will be about adapting and changing what they're delivering online, depending on where they're seeing the most improvements for the different aspects that they're using from the tool.
Certainly. And I think this particular project ties into another project that you've been working on related to anti-doping education. We actually spoke last year to Dr. Andrew Hayes, who was on the podcast, and he was working with you on a fascinating project that was actually evaluating the World Anti-Doping Agency's International Standard for Education, or ISE. So listeners, check out episode 128 if you've missed that one. But can you give us a brief explanation of the goal of this project, Ian, and maybe talk about any updates of what you're seeing in terms of changes or potential strengths of this ISE?
So Andy did his PhD here at Birmingham as well, but he's in a unique position. There's probably one or two examples around the world as well, but he's an elite athlete as well. So he gives us a very unique insight into, because he's obviously seeing the anti-doping system from the other side as an elite athlete, but also as a researcher as well, which is really good. And having that insight as part of this project has been really useful. Martin, who you mentioned earlier, is also working on this project as well. So it's quite a team effort. And then I've also got a couple of other colleagues as well. So Jules Wolfe, who's over at Illinois, is part of it. And then another colleague here, Shushu Chen, who does a lot of work around sport policy in the school here, is involved because there are obviously very strong sort of policy implications coming from this project. But we've been in quite a privileged position with this project because there are two main sort of work packages that we're running in the project. And one of them is actually using anonymized data from WADA that is part of their compliance process. So across international standards, WADA have a compliance process that some of the listeners might be aware of to ensure that anti-doping organizations are being compliant with what's required in the World Anti-Doping Code. One part of that compliance process, I think there's 29 questions around education. We've got anonymized data from across the globe for those 29 questions specifically. So we don't know the organization involved, but we can see things like how much education they're delivering, how much of it is values-based, how much of it is anti-doping education, how much awareness raising, so on, so forth. How many coaches, which whereabouts on the athlete pathway they're delivering education to, who's part of their education pool of athletes, because that's another element of the international standard. And what we've also got, and it's not a direct comparison because we've got data from 2017 when the compliance process was completed then as well. So there were education questions in 2017, but obviously they're not the same questions because the questions now are very much centered around the international standard for education. In 2017, that didn't exist. But there are several questions that are very similar in terms of the volume of education delivered. And there are some questions around the types of education delivered that are very similar as well. So by having access to anonymized data from 2017 as well, we can make comparisons to see what are the changes in education delivery, or at least some of the high-level changes from when the international standard was brought in 2021. And what we're seeing from this is a real step change in terms of the volume, the amount of education that's been delivered. And the initial data that we had was, some listeners might know that anti-doping organizations are categorized into different tiers. At the moment, we've analyzed the data from tiers 1 to 3. Very soon, we'll get the data from tier 4 as well. So we'll also, once we've got that, we'll be able to make comparisons across the different tiers. So basically, tier 1 are often the larger and better funded international federations and NADOs. And then tier 4 are the smaller organizations. So we'll be able to look to see whether those changes that we've seen so far are happening across all of the tiers as well. But the very encouraging sign that we've seen so far is that we've seen that the international standard has brought about a real change in the amount of education delivered, and also the breadth of the types of education being delivered has increased as well. And then the other part of the project, so that's obviously quantitative, that part, but we've got a qualitative element of the project as well. And this is working with 6 anti-doping organizations across the globe. And we've got coverage of Asia, Africa, the Americas, and Europe within that. So we've got good global representation. We've got different tiers represented in there as well. And what we're doing in this work package, we're seeing here some convergence in what we're seeing in the numbers with what people are telling us as well, which is good. So we're conducting interviews with staff in the education teams across those 6 organisations. We're also conducting interviews at times with the CEOs of some of the organisations as well. And I think that the CEOs of the organisations are volunteering to come forward and be interviewed. And I think that reflects one of the key themes that we've seen from these interviews as well, is that one of the main things that staff in the education departments and education managers tell us when we interview them about what's the impact of the international standard been, is that education is now taken more seriously. And that is represented by CEOs coming forward to us and saying they want to be interviewed. It's also reflected in more funding within the budget of an organisation being allocated to education. We've seen real increases there as well. And this is something that's been discussed at a global education conference that WIDER have held most recently in France, but in Australia as well, not too long ago. And this increase in funding and budget that we've seen because the international standard then allows for obviously more staff, but also better training, better education programs to be put in place. So that was one of the sort of key benefits that we've seen as well. I think if we get down into sort of the more fine-grained elements of what we've seen, so as well as interviewing staff, we've also interviewed athletes and athlete support personnel in each of those countries to get the perspective and the understanding from the recipients of education as well. And I think we've seen evidence from the athletes and athlete support personnel that they've recognised and appreciated an increase in the quality and quantity of education that's been delivered since the international standard came in. I think when we look at the specific elements of the international standard, and particularly here I'm thinking about the staff in education departments, because you wouldn't necessarily expect athletes and athlete support personnel to understand the intricacies of the international standard, but the staff certainly do. That allows us to get an understanding of how the international standard might be developed further to further support and guide education delivery. And WIDER were always very clear on this from the outset, that the first version of the international standard was very much seen as not wanting to reach too far, because if you expect too much, then that can just be overwhelming for organisations, but always with a view to very quickly reviewing the international standard and then looking to improve it. And that's reflected in a process that's going on at the moment. It's also reflected probably in the funding of the project that I'm leading around the evaluation of the international standard. But what we've been lucky in being able to do as well, and again, this is sort of working closely with the World Anti-Doping Agency, is reporting at various points in terms of what some of our findings have been. Because at the moment, WIDER are developing the next version of the international standard with a view to that being ready by the end of this year, but also being operational and part of the new World Anti-Doping Code that will come into operation in 2027. So that gives just over a year for organisations to appreciate the changes, to put processes in place to make sure that they're compliant with it by the time it comes in 2027. But what has been a real sort of privilege has been able to sort of feed into that process and report into WIDER and our findings to help inform that process as well. And what WIDER do with each of their standards is they'll have a process whereby stakeholders can feed in and report back on the new standards that it's seen or particular elements of the international standard that WIDER are looking to improve. So there's been 2 of those periods for the stakeholder feedback so far, and we've fed into those as well with our findings. And then it looks as though there'll be a third and final one in the next coming months as well. So there's an optional period around March and April in 2025 for a third period for stakeholders to feedback. It's optional for each of the standards, but I think it looks like education are going to utilise that. So there'll be another opportunity for basically what's likely to be an almost final version of the next international standard. So we've interviewed all the staff on 2 occasions. The second time we interviewed them, we've been asking them about some of the proposed changes and getting feedback on that so we can try and feed directly into this process. And what we're first seeing is actually some of the areas that WIDER have developed the international standard are consistent with what we're seeing in those original interviews in some of the areas where maybe there could be improvement. Not so much in what was in the standard, but in how the standard is being used by organisations. So a key area there would be monitoring and evaluation, where the international standard said that monitoring and evaluation should take place and that should inform future delivery of education. We saw some inconsistencies in how that was being applied. So the way in which the standard is being developed now is giving more guidance around monitoring and evaluation. And then the feedback that we're getting from organizations in the round 2 is very supportive of the changes that are being put in place. So it's almost like we're conducting the research and the evaluation sort of live as this process is taking place, which is very interesting to see. But thankfully, what we're seeing is a very strong occurrence of the themes that we're seeing in our research with how the international standard is being developed as well. And the ability to sort of feed into that process has been really rewarding.
Definitely. And I think this is certainly an important and timely topic. So I'm glad you were able to share some of the details of this project. And I know we've covered a few different kinds of projects that you're working on. Were there any others that are top of mind right now that you're really excited about and want to share with me and listeners?
So I've got a couple of PhD students at the moment, and both of them doing work in the area of anti-doping. One is specifically looking at the international standard in education development within karate specifically. So that's quite interesting because it's looking at a particular sport where education, certainly within this country, is maybe not developed as much as in other sports. So we can see how that might be influencing perceptions within the sport. The other PhD is in collaboration with UK Anti-Doping again. And that's a very exciting project with a lot of potential for impact, not just in UK Anti-Doping, but within anti-doping more broadly. So actually this relates to another element of the World Anti-Doping Code that to a large part relates to testing with anti-doping. So the World Anti-Doping Code states that anti-doping organizations have to go through a risk assessment process to identify which particular sports, which particular groups might be most at risk. And that's meant to inform the testing process, testing protocols, and targeted testing and so on. So at the moment, from our understanding and from what we've seen so far, certainly in some organizations, it seems to be a fairly sort of subjective. So it's a bringing together of different departments and trying to understand and use the data that's available, but it's quite opinion-based. It's not probably as data-informed as it could be. What we're aiming to do in this project is develop a mathematical model which will bring together all relevant data. So that might be testing protocols, it might be test results, where we're seeing anti-doping rule violations, where we're seeing adverse analytical findings, whereabouts issues, but also bringing in, and this is something that's probably not utilized so much now and might be another way in which UK Anti-Doping's use of that tool we talked about earlier might come in, is to use some of the more social and psychological data within this process as well. So what we're looking to do in this 4-year PhD is to identify currently what data are used in this process, what other data might be available for the process, and develop a mathematical model which will automate the process of bringing those data together and actually show where some of the greater risks might be, and therefore to sort of inform the testing process. This is in collaboration. One of the supervisory team is from UK Anti-Doping. But if we're able to successfully develop such a model, then the long-term intention will be to sort of disseminate that to other organizations as well and to wider, so it can be used more widely. That's a very exciting project as well. I've got a colleague over in mathematics who's part of the supervisory team as well. He's developed similar models, but in other domains such as modern slavery. So we have got a test case of how this can be done successfully. It's just that we're now bringing that into sort of the anti-doping domain.
Well, Ian, it sounds like you've got your work cut out for you over the next several years, at least.
Yeah.
Quite a few big projects going on there in the lab. And I think there are still so many unanswered questions in anti-doping, and particularly in this kind of sports psychology realm of it. So what do you see as some of the major gaps in research on doping from a sports psychology perspective?
I think we probably alluded to some of them there. I think the research that I've been involved in some quite large reviews and meta-analyses recently where we've looked at what some of the psychological indicators of doping might be and also protective factors. I think some of the research gaps now is looking at how we can best use that information to inform education within clean sport and anti-doping. I think at the moment we'll see interventions developed within academia, and we'll see evidence that we might see changes in, say, intentions to dope as an outcome, which is it all. We might see reductions in moral disengagement, which is indicative that the intervention is effective. What we're not seeing is that that is the type of intervention that can take place within the realm of anti-doping. Because quite often some of these interventions might be 1 to 2 hour sessions, 6 weeks in a row. And when you speak to anti-doping organizations, they'll say, well, we don't get access to athletes 6 weeks in a row for 1 to 2 hours. We get 1 hour or we get 2 hours with them, or 1 hour in person and then 1 hour online. So I think what we've got to try to identify is first whether the interventions that are being used within clean sport and anti-doping education are changing some of those psychological characteristics that we've recognized are linked with risk and protection against use of doping. And also then once we've got that evidence to see how can we optimize these interventions. So I think that's definitely one of the major next steps. I think other areas are probably more methodological. I think we need much more sort of long-term research, seeing how over time some of these psychological characteristics develop in athletes. So a lot of the evidence base at the moment is cross-sectional. So I think we need to be able to fund and conduct much more longitudinal studies, particularly if we're working with athletes through sort of non-risk periods for adopting doping, so that we can see that we've got changes in these constructs. So does moral disengagement increase? Does self-regulatory efficacy decrease through these periods when athletes are increasingly likely to dope and maybe increase their intentions to dope through those periods? So yeah, I think methodologically we need much more longitudinal research, and within the interventions that we're developing them, we need to make them more sort of practical and think about the pragmatics and the realities of anti-doping and clean sport education. I think some of the other sort of key areas that we can look to develop more, so there has been increased focus on inadvertent doping. We've done some research around inadvertent doping in recent years as well, but still the majority of research that we see is tackling intentional doping. So increased understanding of sort of the risk and protective factors for inadvertent doping would be important. I think previously you've maybe interviewed Nikos Troumanis as well, a colleague of mine on some research in this area, and also who led the meta-analysis that I mentioned earlier. And one of the things that we did in the most recent meta-analysis, which was funded by PCC, was to look at inadvertent doping. But one of the conclusions from that was that the evidence base around that at the moment is fairly weak compared to intentional doping. So hopefully the next time that a meta-analysis is conducted in maybe another 5 or 10 years, we'll have a much stronger evidence base to help inform us what some of the risk factors and protective factors against inadvertent doping are. Because as we see in sort of the media, quite often either claimed or in reality, inadvertent doping is potentially a major issue that we need to guard against. And it's certainly something WADA are interested in. They've got a task force at the moment looking at inadvertent doping specifically. So I think within the area of research, we need to do much more in that area. It's a very difficult area to investigate because with doping, you're investigating an actual behavior that you can observe or ask someone about. By its very nature and by definition, inadvertent doping is something people don't know they've done. So you have to measure the behaviors that are protective against it rather than the behavior itself, which is obviously brings about challenges.
And I think your answer just now got into a bit of this in terms of just the practicality, the longer term studies, the challenges with studying some of these behaviors that you want to look at. But are there any other challenges that you'd like to highlight that you face in your work today as a researcher in this area?
I think historically, some of the challenges have been around access and accessing the right populations. That's increasingly improving. Athlete representation on committees, athlete involvement, athlete interest in clean sport promotion helps with that access. I think working directly with anti-doping organizations, with national governing bodies, and engaging them in the research that you're doing are some of the ways that you can overcome those challenges. But certainly getting access to the right populations, because it's okay conducting research on convenience samples and student athlete populations that we can generate important findings, but we need to make sure that those findings are relevant to the populations that are in the testing pools, in the education pools, who are in those periods sort of moving from national to international level competition, which we know are sort of at-risk populations. We need to make sure that we show those findings are important in those groups as well. And yes, that research is more difficult, is more challenging, but it's important that we approach those challenges. I think in terms of the longitudinal research is just challenging itself because finding your participant again the next time in itself is not easy. So it's associated with more attrition than you would see with, say, interventional research, where you might only need to access your population for a few weeks while you conduct the intervention and maybe 3 months for a follow-up test. That's not too difficult as long as you got the funding for the research. If you're looking to conduct research where you're following people over several years, naturally get attrition because people just stop participating in sport. But you also get attrition because you can't find where people are. And it's also very expensive, and the sort of funding streams to fund the research funders are not always able to fund something that might take several years to conduct. So that's definitely very challenging, trying to find ways in which you can conduct that research. But I think it's important that we do. And it might be a case of some of the larger, more sort of collaborative projects that we've been involved in the past that run over several years. It's those kind of approaches that I think are needed. Maybe certainly within Europe, some of the big EU funding would be able to cover that type of research. But it's usually sort of the financial cost, but also the attrition of some of the big challenges around the longitudinal work.
Definitely. And I think these collaborations, this is such an important point because the field of anti-doping is sort of necessarily collaborative. So can you share how you and your lab group collaborate with other stakeholders, whether it's funding organizations like the PCC, national anti-doping organizations, or others in the work that you do?
For me, and I'm not saying that I saw this from the outset, it is something that I've learned over the years, and I certainly conduct that. I think historically research is much more, it's sort of, right, I'll conduct my research. Now we've got these findings, I'll go and tell my stakeholders about it, and surely they should just change their practice or policy because I've got these findings. And I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this, but strangely enough, that doesn't work that well.
Right.
Sometimes it will work, but there needs to be some serendipity there. You just got a particular interest in a stakeholder and you've got a particular finding, and those two meet at the same time, then yes, you might get some impact there. What works much better is if you engage with the stakeholders from the outset and try to understand the type of research that they would like doing, which would be most useful to them, and then design the project around that. And that's why when you look across sort of the portfolio of work that we're doing in the lab here, it's quite broad. And that's because different stakeholders have quite broad interests in different areas. So sometimes that takes me away from what historically have been sort of my primary interests in research. And I'm quite comfortable and happy with that. I'm primarily interested in doing research that matters, that's impactful. I've worked with already to date probably at least 15 different anti-doping organizations. Another project that we just got starting that Nikos is leading, who I mentioned earlier, probably going to be working with about another 6. So I think the more stakeholders that you can work with, and I do similarly within my work in sort of anabolic steroid use in exercise populations as well. So we have stakeholder relationships, and Martin Chandler, who I mentioned earlier, is now doing a 1-year postdoc research with CGL, who are a major harm reduction needle exchange provider within the UK, who are the largest supplier of sort of harm reduction work with anabolic steroid users. So we're operating similarly in terms of engaging and working with stakeholders in that area as well, because we value and recognize the importance of getting that input from the stakeholders. And obviously the funding that comes from PCC is very important as well. And their sort of interesting social science research alongside the sort of development of tests and the work on that area of science as well. You mentioned that anti-doping is collaborative, but also within the way in which the funding operates, the stakeholders and the funders of research are very much engaged with the research as well. And I don't think that's necessarily the case in all areas of science, where quite often a funder will fund a piece of research and then you'll maybe report in a set number of times, but the engagement with the stakeholders is probably not as regular as you would see with some of the funders within anti-doping and clean sport, which I think is a real plus for the area and why we probably see so much impact coming from the work within anti-doping and clean sport.
I definitely agree with that. And I know we've talked about a lot of the impactful research that you've been doing, Ian, and the challenges, of course, that you've faced. But if we removed all of the barriers that normally hold you back, what dream research question would you answer first?
So I think if financial resources were not a barrier, a program of research where we're sort of developing and implementing an intervention and then tracking it long term would be an incredible project to be able to run. Working directly with stakeholders, clearly, and developing it based on the work that they've done in the past, informed by results to date, but also developing within that systems where they can effectively evaluate and monitor and evaluate the research that they're doing so that the program becomes self-sustainable in terms of its effectiveness and development beyond the end of the project. So I think certainly within anti-doping and clean sport, in the same way that the prohibited list evolves, I think education's always looking to evolve as well, because the processes and procedures that athletes need to be educated around are always evolving. The way in which we're delivering education needs to evolve. But it needs to be an intrinsic element of the program of education that you develop that can be monitored and evaluated. And within that, what I'd like to do is sort of bring in much more of sort of the psychological and psychosocial variables that we know from research are very important issues and factors in the development of doping or in protective factors encouraging clean sport. And I think that's one of the things that's come from our current projects where we're evaluating the international standard is that quite often these constructs and psychosocial constructs and the psychometric measures that have been developed are not adopted and used as much within the monitoring and evaluation as we would like to see. So the project that I mentioned with Nikos, that Nikos is leading, that is looking to develop very user-friendly short measures that are much more practical for anti-doping organizations. So it's taking measures that have been developed within research, but making very short versions of them that can be used frequently. So repeated measures, but also you can administer several measures without burdening an athlete with having to complete something that might take 1 hour. So I think incorporating those types of measures within a program of research and developing how an organization can utilize that information to develop and improve the delivery of their education on an ongoing basis would be a great project to be involved in.
Well, Ian, this sounds remarkable. This just idea of creating this program that includes these practical measures and sort of has this built-in feedback system to continue improving over time. I think this is remarkable. Hopefully someday someone out there, if you're listening and want to fund this grand endeavor, definitely get in touch. And listeners, if you just have questions or you want to learn more about the great work that Ian is doing, Ian, can you tell us how they can do so?
You can find me on X or Twitter. My handle on there is MD SportX. So that's moral disengagement in sport and exercise, if you want to try and remember that. I'm also on LinkedIn, and I'll post on either of those if there's any new research coming out. Google Scholar, if you want to actually look at particular pieces of research. And also I have a webpage on the University of Birmingham website that has a link to my research portal. But if there are any pieces of research that a listener can't get hold of, that we've talked about today or that they've seen on one of those places I just talked about, then my email address will be on there anyway. So someone could contact me directly and I'll send through the PDF.
Oh, wonderful. We appreciate that. And listeners, definitely take the time to get connected with Ian. Check out his papers and that website. And Ian, it's been such a pleasure to chat with you today. Thank you so much for your time.
It's been a pleasure. Yeah, thanks again for inviting me on. And it's been really good to have the opportunity to talk about some of these areas of our work.
Well, we appreciate you sharing your work with us today. Listeners, we appreciate you joining us for this conversation. And please note that the Anti-Doping Podcast features a wide variety of clean sport experts, and episodes may include statements and or viewpoints that do not necessarily reflect the views or values of the PCC. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.